Καλησπέρα, ευχαριστούμε που είστε εδώ. Θα μιλήσω λίγο στα αγγλικά γιατί έχουμε και το ξένο μας, ο Δημήτρης μιλάει ελληνικά. Welcome, thank you very much you are here. Today we have with us Antonio Robustelli. Antonio, thank you very much. Kind invitation. Antonio is a professional high performance consultant. He has great experience working with teams. And today he's going to give us a lecture about neuromuscular profile and preventions of injuries, helping the performance. And tomorrow we have in Stάδια Cultural Center, we have a workshop 3 to 5 afternoon, and then we have a lecture 5 to 9. And also we have Δημήτρης Βλαχόπουλος. Thank you, Δημήτρης. Δημήτrης is a pediatric physiologist with great experience with musculoskeletal problems of kids. He has published several publications, and he is working in 5 countries with these topics. And today he's going to present to us training in young age, scientific theories and myths. The discussion is open, and you can ask anytime any questions.
Thank you
very much.
Thanks, Takis. Hope you can all hear me quite clearly. I'm glad that the presentation is in English because my Greek presenting is not great. I know that you can't believe it, but that's the case. I have some words in Greek so everyone understand, but Antonio will explain everything in English. So we'll focus today in a few elements. So the main focus of the presentation will be to understand first which are the developmental stages and how we can actually assess biological age and maturation. We need to understand why, first of all, is important when we're working with young athletes, either at clinical setting or in sports and health science setting, why it's important to assess biological age. And also we'll try to have a look more carefully in the windows of opportunity. So these windows of opportunity are not always justified by the literature, by scientific evidence, but it's important to understand how we can actually focus both in girls and boys. And then we'll mainly focus in the long-term athlete development program, which is a model which we're working with different sports clubs around the world for many years next year. And I'm trying to present also some of the myths and scientific evidence about the exercise training during the developmental stages.
1 second.
Yeah. So let's start with the main stages here. So that's just to highlight which are the different stages and to understand the changes that we have mainly in height, and we have also the skeletal and the muscle growth. And as we know that during infancy we have the greatest acquisition of height, which is not a linear process, but is a step-by-step process. So that's why we have some kids that we haven't seen for a while. And after that we've seen, okay, and we say, okay, this kid has grown up a lot because it's a step process. It's not a linear process as many people think. Then we have the early childhood, which the growth of height is actually reducing the pace. And we have a plateau in the growth until we actually reach one of the most important periods for developmental stages, which is the peak high velocity. We'll see in a while why it's important to focus in this period of life and which are the factors that can actually affect the training in these stages. Now, this is one of my favorite papers in BDSM with hundreds of citations because it combines so nicely all the endocrinological elements and how they actually change during growth. So it's nice because we can see on the top that we have the different pubertal stages based on Tanner states. And we have also some hormonal changes, and we have the peak high velocity, the bone mineral content velocity, and the growth IGF-1 and the growth hormone. Now this is really important because based on these endocrinological changes, we have the windows of opportunity that we'll see later on. It's important to understand that following the peak high velocity, we have the bone mineral content velocity, and after that, we have the peak and decrease in the growth hormone. During this period of life, we have rapid changes in the musculoskeletal system, which usually leads to a higher increase in the prevalence of injuries. And that mainly has to do with the neurological adaptations that take some time for the kids to adapt before we have an actual good coordination level so they can perform the exercises. Now, I have a group task because they asked me to do a more interactive session for you, not just present data and talk to you all the time. So we have a group task, so we can split in small groups, so we can discuss the following points. Because I gathered some of the information, we have some common myths about exercise during growth. And the first, I've outlined 6 of the myths actually. So the first one is one of the classic ones, how we categorize and evaluate young athletes based on chronological age, because this is the main one that we use, for example, in swimming, in football, in rowing, in most of the clubs, we use chronological age to categorize the different stages that the adolescents participate. So, do you believe that the first case is true or false? Is it correct statement? I know it's not in English, but that's why I explained it in Greek. Yeah?
I think it might be wrong because it might be based on the biological or training age, not on chronological.
Great. So that's a nice example. Exactly, the biological age is much more important than chronological age. And do you have in mind any examples of how we can categorize the athletes based on the biological age and not based on the chronological age? We'll outline it later, but that was a good point. It's correct. The term that we use mainly in the UK, now in the US, it's quite popular. It's called biobanding. So the biobanding means that we're trying now to force with scientific evidence to actually change how we categorize each one of the athletes, and based on the maturation level, how they can actually participate in different competitions. That will take lots of work, but does anyone else have any point about that or any argument? You might believe that chronological age is better or worse, depending on the age of the athletes. Yeah?
First of all, you have already indicated that even when we have a boy and a girl growing, they have a different mature stage, and it's not related to the chronological progress of their bodies. So it's very obvious that even based on that, it's totally different.
Is it the same for children and adolescents, or we can use the chronological age in childhood? Because based on that,
we can see that for girls it's different.
Yeah.
And for boys again it's different.
So when you categorize sports, will you use biological age in all stages of childhood and adolescence, or you can use chronological age during childhood and biological age during adolescence?
That's a very good question. Again, what you're actually showing to us gives the answer.
Yeah?
Because we can see that some of them, some stages are parallel, but some others are not going together.
So the answer in this one, that's why it was not correct and I raised the point, is that based on that, we can use the chronological age early in life, and later on we can use the biological. So that's why we have the years of peak high velocity. We can actually assess them and explain more in a while about that. So let's go about the second point. This is a more obvious one. So the long-term athlete development, do you believe it's important for the development of skills? Yes or no, and why? So when we are designing, let's say that we are coaches in a sports club and we just had a new job and we want to design a long project so we can develop the skills of the athletes as much as possible. Do you believe that we need to have a clear long-term plan with specific targets to develop the technical and physical skills of the athletes or not? Or is that actually practical? Who is following that? Any ideas? Yeah?
It would be ideal, but life is not ideal. So we have to, it would be good to have some kind of planning, but also it depends on the target, on the goals that the athlete has. And we can see that those athletes that are more into, professional focusing on, sports, it will definitely work better for them, and they will need to have it, and they will actually find it very useful. But for with substitution, it's not going to make a huge difference.
Okay, you raised two really important points. The first is that quite a few of the athletes, they focus only on the professional aspect, that they want to become professionals. And I found the evidence which proves how much is the percentage that they actually believe that, and how much is the percentage that they actually manage it, which is shocking. The second one is important because that's one of the main raising points and conflicts between coaches or scientists. Because the coaches, they say, okay, if we have a plan, we might be able to help only those that they want to go for a professional one. But based on the Canadian model specifically, that's mainly the American model, which they focus a lot in performance, and that's purely that, and in the UK as well. But in Canada, because that model is a bit more humanitarian, let's say it like that, it's focusing more on health as an endpoint. So you can have a long-term athlete development program, not only for the athletes, the girls and the boys that they actually want to become professionals, but also for those that they want to have a good physical and mental development and also be healthy in the rest of their lives, even if they don't become professionals, because as we'll see later on, not many make it. So the third one, do you believe that's quite conflicting point? Do you believe that the parents, they need to participate or intervene in the long-term athlete development program or the implementation of it? When you had an academy, for example, in any academy that you work with clubs or kids, you always have the parents, which they have the first say, because they want the best for the kids to develop. They are quite demanding sometimes. And do you believe that they need to have a say or involve them or not? And why? Yeah? Or someone else? Yeah?
I think the parents has to be involved in this situation with a way of to speak to the children, not to give attention to the result, but to enjoy the game and all of this. They have to advise the kids.
Brilliant. That's really good, an important point, because the last decade there was evidence that they were trying to exclude the parents because they were complaining a lot, that they were really demanding, which creates problems in all the academies, and we know that what that means. But it's not a solution to exclude them or go against them. The solution is to educate them and involve them in the process of the long-term athlete development and be part of that. Because without the social support that the parents will create for the kids, and the mental support and the psychological development of the kid is not going to be the same. That's why it's so important to involve them. So the other point we have about competitiveness, we raised it a bit. Do you believe that specializing early to become professional during the developmental ages is the right approach to long-term athlete development or not? Shall we try to persuade the kids and the athletes, the young athletes, to be as competitive as possible, as early as possible, so they can become professionals or not? Is it true or false? And why? Yeah?
It depends on the age group we are targeting.
So which group you will focus more on specialization and more competitiveness?
Around 13 to 15 years old.
Okay, that's a good point. I have the research to prove that in which ages are good or bad, but we'll try to find.
Depends on the sport.
It depends on the sport, obviously, but in generally speaking, peak high velocity is again the drive and the tool that we can actually use, how we can adapt the specialization in each sport. Because if we start the specialization quite early, we'll see that the effects of professional development later on are less compared to those that they specialize later. Okay, so that's the general answer, and we'll try to find the evidence later on. Let's try to focus now in when we're trying to focusing in the exercise training hours. If it's quite similar with the previous one, if we need to create, if you believe that more training hours during developmental ages, specifically during childhood and adolescence, can create more champions in the future. So let's say we increase the training load, we will have linear results in terms of how many professional athletes or Olympic medals in the case of UK that I care a lot, will have a better result for that or not? Based on increasing purely the training load. Because that's a classic. If we want to improve the skills or something else, we say you need to increase the training hours or the technique, and it's based on that. Any ideas? Yeah?
I'm just thinking of an example of one of our academies.
Yeah, bring that example. It's the best you can.
It's actually that we are trying to do rapid training twice a week,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about primary school children.
Mm-hmm.
And the parents actually, because we receive feedback to see what kind of impact this has to the children later on, when they're done with training and
Yeah.
their daily obligations. And they realize that at early ages, this is too much. So they need to see that more in the form of a game, and slowly to add in a more standard, on a more standard stage, which is say as a daily or every 2 or 3 days, and more frequent.
Exactly.
Exercise.
So that's exactly the right answer for that. So when we are specifically for primary school or during childhood, we need to have a more game form and enjoy the game and have more of the fundamental movement skills. The FMS that I will present later on in the long-term athlete development, that's the main point for that. So we need to focus a lot on developing these basic skills and techniques, rather focus on specializing in specific one. Now it depends on the sport, as someone said earlier, it depends on the sport and also on the training level of the individual when we try to make it more personalized. And the last one, that's one of my favorites, do you believe that the talent identification can actually happen more effectively from the young ages by having the right testing techniques? So let's say even we have biomechanics or psychology or fitness performance, do you believe that we can actually predict if we can have a talent, let's say in the future? Yeah?
And definitely have an indication.
Yeah.
How life is going to make this person and alter his or her decision.
Mm-hmm.
Different thing, but you can definitely see differences. You can definitely see differences even among children that their body type is different.
Mm-hmm.
You have expectations from others, and from others you have different expectations. So you can have a small indication, but this is not the alpha and the omega of the whole thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. The percentage of success during childhood to present if you will actually have a talent is minimal. Because there are profound changes that happen during adolescence, and these changes, they usually change the whole aspect of someone reaching the elite level. So the age that they usually try to do more, we'll have some algorithms developed so we can predict the talent with specific testing, and I'll explain later in a while. But let's say in the age after peak high velocity, when the whole physical development and the mental is more stable and we have some basic physical components, we need to use some reference standards so we can compare all these physical and mental components of the athletes so we can see in which level they are and create like we call it talent profile based on that, and I'll show it in a while. But the answer in that is like the later we're going, the more effective the prediction of the algorithm will be. So let's start now with a bit of theoretical evidence. We have chronological versus biological age from Aspetar. It's a group in Qatar, which they outline quite nicely that we can have some population which they're the same age, but they have totally different biological age. So the skeletal age, for example, we have someone, the chronological age range, we have, it can range between minus 1.4 years. So if we have the same two girls that are 12 years old, one of the two girls biologically might be 13 or 15, and someone can be even 10. Okay? So that's why it's really important to keep these athletes, to assess the biological age, which is something simple to do, at least in the academies, and then based on that, to try to develop them based on this specific biological age and not only about the chronological age, because this creates lots of issues about competitiveness and when we're selecting the individuals to attend even national teams or international. At least that was a big case in the UK. So the relative age effect, we have an example. This is another point. When we have two kids born in the same year, which chronologically they can play in the same age category in any sport, but they're born in different months. And specifically during the years, for example, when we're talking about 9 years, and as we're going closer to adolescence in peak high velocity, this plays a massive role. And we have a biased selection by selecting those that are taller, stronger, and they're more physical, not because they're actually better as athletes, but because they just matured earlier. So you exclude the rest, and you're losing those talents that they can actually be better later on. And we'll try to prove that with an evidence. So in basketball, it was an example that they combined around 300 athletes, and they assessed them from the age of 5, which was quite good. A big group, different maturity levels, different ages, and they followed them longitudinally. To prove this, to scientifically prove that, we need long-term evidence, which obviously it costs a lot, but is the most robust evidence and has scientific value. So what happens after the age of 10 until 13, before they peak high velocity, when they're starting to start growing in different levels and patterns, as we've seen the height when it was changing, at that point we have an exclusion only of those that were actually shorter and not worse in the techniques. So they started excluding them based on participation in different competitions, and that resulted in total exclusion and also dropout of the sport in basket, which was a big case in the US as well, and they tried to reverse later on, but it was not possible. So after that, what happened? They stayed only with those that they were taller, but not technically better than the others. Okay, so that's just an example to give you of what happens and why biological age is so important. So let's go to a bit more practical stuff. Even if we are medics or sports scientists or anything else, we need to know the methods how to assess biological age. The golden standard to do that is to use the radiography when we have the X-ray. We have the atlas, and obviously there are much newer techniques. We use now software, which we can actually see the epiphyseal plates, how they open and close, and based on that to assess the specific skeletal age that someone has. But obviously that's time consuming to bring them to the hospital, to do the X-ray, to have the skeletal age, and also expose the children to radiation, which sometimes is not necessary. We have the Tanner stages, which have been used extensively since 1962, which we can assess the biological development, and it's self-reported from the girls and the boys. But sometimes that creates some ethical issues. At least in the UK, we had some issue that can we actually show naked pictures to the kids, or it's a bit weird. We need to have the approval of the parents and then approach it, and after having the right approval without having any conflict. But still, it worked a lot, and we have different categorization based on the Tanner stages. And one of the most widely used now, we have the peak high velocity. So based on specific algorithms, in the past by using sitting height, height and age, we can actually predict the peak high velocity. And now we can do it quite precisely. There are some algorithms from Canada, from Saskatchewan University, that now we don't even need a sitting height. So the only thing that you need is age and the height in the specific case. And based on that, we can see how far away is someone, a girl, how far away is from the peak high velocity. So how many years is away from reaching that peak in the height. So if we can calculate that it's -2 years or -1, as we've seen in the previous case, in that case we can adapt a bit the training or the technical aspects and wait until the full development happens before we're deciding to have more intensive programs or selecting for the national teams. A nice example that we have based on the height and biological age is that we have some early matures, the average and late. Now this creates some issues and discrepancies between the total height reached, and in that case we have the early matures which they actually reach a bit higher peak in the high velocity. So we've seen, if you remember in primary school, we said okay, someone grew up a lot and he or she is taller than the rest of the classmates. But this is not always the case because later on they can catch up. But generally speaking, research has proven that the late matures, they actually have lower peak high velocity and acquisition of height as they're growing up. What we can do with the peak high velocity, we can bring these lines together. That's why it's so useful when we're assessing young population to use and categorize them based on that. So by using the peak high velocity equations and categorize them based on that, we can actually bring these lines together. So, sorry, that's in Greek, Antonio. So that's the long-term athlete development and what it means. It's just some basic information and why the LTAD is important. And it's actually just a model, it's not proven. I would love to have a research project to prove that. There are some evidence of longitudinal studies, but it's not scientifically proven to say, okay, we're focusing 500 population, we follow them, and we'll have a randomized control trial to see if it's actually working. There is no case like that yet. But there is evidence that we have a good development based on biological characteristics and the development of the skills and the specific movement characteristics is improved even if we're going for a champion level or a health lifestyle level. So in both cases, the long-term athlete development can help. And this is just an example in Greek to show you that can provide really useful information both for the parents and the coaches and the kids. So we have the different models. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but we have obviously the physical literacy, it's called, and we have the 3 first stages, which we have the active start, and we have the categorization of the girls we have between and boys between 0 and 6 levels, which is important to develop the fundamental movement skills. We have the fundamentals, which we start having the difference between the girls and the boys, because we know that the girls, they mature earlier, so we need to slightly adapt the model based on this pace of growth. We have the learning to train, which is the most important part and is usually skipped by the most competitive countries, even if that's US or UK or Greece, because we forget to learn the basics, how we need to train first, and that's between the ages of 8 to 11 and 8 to 12 in boys, before we even start training for train, okay? And then we move for the training to train, as you can see, where training to train is between 11 and 15 for girls and 12 to 16, so it's quite late. And most of the people, they start specializing quite early, and that creates so many other issues later on, which I'll show you the evidence which supports that. We have learning to compete, so you can see the competition starts at 15 for females and at 16 for males. So it's at the latest stage, after we have all the other characteristics developed and the technical and the physical skills, and then we start developing on that. Because if we start earlier, we might have some cases when we're working with elite athletes, for example, we might see that someone, okay, they met all the criteria of the physical or mental skills if we have the assessment, so we can push a bit further on, so we can drive them towards the professional development. And then we have the training to compete, which usually is the age of Olympics, between 9 to 23 for females and 20 to 23 for males. Obviously depends on the sport, as you correctly said. And finally, we have the training to win. But all these, they lead for active for life. So that's really important. So even if someone is training for a professional athlete, it's important to keep in mind that in the end of this development in the academy, even if she doesn't or he doesn't become a professional, they need to be physically active and have this base for the rest of their lives. Not just to become an athlete and then say, oh, when I was young, I was playing in the national team and now I just hate it because I had an injury and everything else. That's a classic excuse we're listening to most of the countries. And that's the case because we're not focusing for the active for life and because we're skipping those levels by many coaches and professionals and scientists. So this is an example of how these fundamental skills can be developed more specifically in different stages of the development of growth. And I know that this is a busy slide, but it's based on one of the most complete papers from Lloyd and Oliver in Cardiff, some colleagues that they published it back in 2012. So we have the age groups as we've seen previously. We have the growth rates, which will have the rapid growth and steady, and then we have the spurt of the adolescent spurt. And we have the maturation stages, which we explained about that. And we have the training adaptations. That's important, and that's how it links with the topic of today's talk. So we have neural and age-related adaptations until we actually finish the mid-childhood, until the age of 10. Okay? So if we have neural adaptations, we're focusing more on the technical skills. And then once we move after to adolescent spurt, we can have a combination of neural and hormonal adaptations, and this means that we can actually add some specific components of agility, speed, and strength, so we can improve these aspects. And you can see here, for example, how the bigger the letters are, the more the focus of the fundamental movement skills during this period of life, and then it becomes smaller. And then with SSS, we have the sport-specific skills. We can see how it's increasing as we're going up, as it's expected. And all these are relevant, but you can find more details in the paper. And also there is long-term athlete development guidelines in English in the UK. We have it for almost every single sport. And it's the same case for males. Now, the windows of opportunity of improving these skills, some of them are proven scientifically and some others are not. But generally speaking, for females, we have the speed and suppleness in the skills. We have some of the basic these skills before the peak high velocity. And you can see here that we have the speed too and the stamina around peak high velocity. And females, they need two different strength levels to improve the strength after peak high velocity. And that's mainly because on the development of females, because it's different compared to the males, we need to have a complete profile, neurological profile to be completed before we can start the strength training. In boys, it's not the same because we can have some of these skills a bit earlier on, before they start actually having, before the peak high velocity, but still you can see how these skills can adapt, and you can see the difference, for example, between females and males. Now, these are the basic guidelines in terms of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. I have it just here just to show you that there are 10 clear points why the model is important to be applied, and also where you can find it. And this is the updated paper in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research from the National Strength and Conditioning Association, and is open access for everyone, which have really clear points of why each one of them works and why we have the benefits for the professionals, the parents, and the athletes. So let's go now why we need to have a model of this outlines in Greek, actually, what I said earlier. And this is mainly to try to create a model based on the specific development of the kids by using the techniques that we know for each specific sport. I cannot give you really specific guidelines based on the sport because each sport is different, and you need to focus on the specific guidelines of each one of these so you can have a look how you can actually develop your model. But the most developed academies that we're usually working, they try to create the LTAD as a pathway to improve generally the athletes, and then when the time comes and they have a really strong profile of these athletes, they try to push harder at the right time so they can make them professionals. So I will call it more as a pathway. So group discussion topics 2, I'll translate that for you, Antonio. So in which group stage do you believe that we need to specialize in the athletes so we can have the best possible development of the skills of the young athletes? How early we need to specialize? Do you have an age in mind? Yeah?
Around 12 years old.
12? Okay. Someone else? So I'll go for 12. Let's have the evidence. So this a really comprehensive, nice study from Denmark, which they always focus in elite athletes. They had a nice study. So they separate, we have two different groups of athletes. So we have near elite athletes, which they won a mental championship at the European level, European championship or senior level, which is a really good level already. And elite athlete, which they placed in the top 10 championship and at the world level by having an Olympics or World Cup medal, which is the main outcome. So what they've seen, they checked when they actually specialized. Okay, so if we are specializing at the age, you can see, for example, we have here the different sports training specific hours, the accumulator of loading, and we can check if this loading, when we increase it, if it will have the same effects later on. So if we start the specialization, increase the loading at 12 years old, 11.7 to be precise, obviously you can see the loading is higher here. It stays higher at 15 because you need to increase it based, once you start increasing the loading, then you need to keep it consistent based on the hours of training. What happens exactly after peak high velocity and after the full physical and mental and neural development? Those that they developed, they trying to focusing on specializing in each specific sport from 15 onwards, they had much better results and the specialization later on, which resulted to be an elite athlete. So this is exactly the evidence, one of the few out there, which actually proves why specializing later is much better than specializing early. There is more evidence indicating that you can actually, the earlier you specialize, the bigger the dropout of the academy. Some they don't care about the dropout. They say, I have 300 athletes, I will burn them out, and I will pick the best of them. That's usually in developed countries or not those that are focusing on the good development of the athletes. So that means that if we're starting specialized, for example, I've seen in a basketball academy a few weeks back that they did pick and roll in primary school, which was unbelievable. You cannot specialize and have so technical skills and so specific for the sport before you even know how to walk or run or jump. It doesn't make sense. And this will have an effect later on in the performance and obviously because we care about medals and performance, the later it is, this is the evidence that proves it. So, injury risk. That was another really good point. So, we have a difference, for example, will you recommend to young athletes to participate in more sports than when they are young, during, let's say, childhood, compared to when you want to explicitly focus on only one sport? So let's say that you have an academy and you're training even for swimming or cycling or football. Will you recommend to your academy during childhood to focus only on that specific sport and develop the skills only for that sport? Or you will recommend to have participation in other sports as well and then decide what they will do? And why? Shall we focusing explicitly at the beginning only in one sport, or shall we encourage them to be to more sports? Yeah?
We're talking about the very early stages of life.
Yeah, childhood or before adolescence.
Yes, definitely they can give it a go and try different sports and see which one they would prefer or how they feel with the sports.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe choose the one that they want to dedicate themselves. But
Yeah.
later on, when we're getting closer to the adolescence or the pre-adolescence period,
Yeah.
then it's better to start focusing on a specific one because that's when the actual progress is about to start growing.
Mm-hmm.
So better at that point to be focused on one sport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We can also develop the motor development in the early stages.
Yeah.
So they can be a better athletes after that.
So even if we are in one sport, we can actually develop the motor skills by having and playing something else. That's a good example. So the answer for that, when they tried, for example, in basketball, and they checked how many they had, even in terms of the injury risk or career longevity in NBA players, so how many they made it and they were more successful and how many they lost during injury games. So we have those that had multi-sport in high school athletes, which is after adolescence. I know that we discuss about childhood, but I asked that because even during high school, if they participate in more sports, it will give them better coordination and mental, psychological skills to develop and become better later on. That's why we've seen, if we specialize at 15, we've seen clearly that the elite athletes, they're better. So even at high school, which is 16 to 18, which is quite late, but basketball, it can be late. This is a specific sport. We cannot generalize it to everything. But in this case, we've seen that those that were in multi-sports, they had less number of games missed, less major injuries during the career, and also they had also much less, which is the most important for life, at least for the Canadian model, much less they were actually, much more they were active for the rest of the study after the NBA time of the study. So that means clearly that we need to encourage both at the young stage or later stage to participate in more sports. Obviously, we know that's quite hard, but what we can do, that was the best example, to try to incorporate in our training different games from other sports. Have you heard stories, for example, Shaquille O'Neal of dancing? There was an article about Shaquille O'Neal of dancing. Why he was dancing? Because when he was rotating, actually, he was improving all the skills. And he did the dancing as part of his training, so he can improve the roll technique, so he can go closer to the basket and have more points. And that was even at the peak of his career, not only at the stage that they were discussing at high school. So that's just an example of an article I'm telling you because Shaquille is just known to everyone. So that's one of my favorites because I destroy all the fantasies of parents and kids. Fantasy versus reality. What's the odds of making to the pro sport? Okay? So if we go to an academy, if you have an academy, how many they will make it to be professional? How many they believe it first? And how many of them they will make it? So that's really shocking. Because you can see, for example, we have the different stages, those at different stages that they hope to become professionals, which is almost 1 in 3. That's sport specific. If you ask all the football players, they all believe that they will become professionals. It's magic. All the football players, they will be professionals. That's one example that we have in the UK. That doesn't change. Even in Brazil, I've seen it. Even in Scandinavia, it doesn't matter of the country. All the football players, they believe they will be professionals, which is amazing. And then we have the high school percentage, which they are drafted to actually become the drafted. And this is an American model. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but we have some drafts. Only 0.04% is drafted. For the NCAA, which are drafted to pros, which is the first stage, 0.7%. And those that they make it from the NCAA later on eligible athletes, which were drafted to pros, is 3.16. And this is a nice categorization of each one of the sports of how these are actually changing. So you can see which one is the most successful and the least as well. Obviously, football is one of the fewest because it's the most popular and we have the bigger dropout in the percentage. But this is just an example to show you how many they believe they will become professionals, how many they make it, and why we do not need to focus to make them professionals. As clear as that. We should not focus on making them professionals and push them for that. We need to focus on everyday training routine, the microcycles, the long-term development, the specific skills. And after we reach that level, and if we have a potential good athlete, then we can start a specialization, and then we can push them to become elite athletes. Only then. Because if we focus early on, we'll destroy all those that they might have the chance to become athletes, and also make the life of the rest of them worse in physical lifestyle than just being physically active and have a nice physical and health and long-term health. So in terms of, that's another of the myths out there, should we be doing resistance training during growth? Shall we have resistance training and during growth? That's a classic myth in the past, at least. I hope the myth is busted now. But we need to have exercises to improve the strength and condition of the young athletes. And yes, we can start from a young age, but the most important is that we need to focus on the neural aspects first. So we have the strength, some basic fundamental movement skills, and we have some technical and tactical motor coordination until we are in the middle of childhood. In the adolescence, we can have some sport-specific skills that we've seen in the parahypertrophy, and I'll explain in a while which specifics we can use. But this is the guideline which proves that we need to have the strength training early on, as long as they say that it's not maximal. One maximal repetition, we should avoid that. At least before peak high velocity and before the full development, we should not do maximal effort. Everything else will help with the muscle development, with the skeletal development, and the performance as well, depending on the side of the body, depending on the sport as well. So that's the small words, obviously, in each one of these papers, that it says the training model should be individualized athletes based on the sex, maturation, and training history. That's the most important for me. Because if we have an athlete that's coming to us at 10 or 12 years of age, we will have a totally different training history. Even if we have the same biological history, the training history and the experience will be totally different, and we need to adapt the model and go back in time. So they should focus on the fundamental movement skills before they're moving to be together with someone else. At least for the first 6 months, that's quite basic that all the good academies, at least in the UK, they follow it now. So that's the guidelines. Again, the position statement from Lloyd in 2012. We have all the guidelines and specific examples of the youth resistance training guidelines. And what we have is, I just highlighted the most important, we need to have qualified professionals, which they need to supervise the programs and be consistent with the needs, the goals and the abilities of the younger population. So we need to be quite specific in this case when we talk about resistance training. We need to have, obviously, the equipment and the logical progression as prescribed. When we say progression, the progression starts usually, the progressive output with increasing of the load is usually after peak high velocity. And we need to avoid having, for example, we have an increased risk of health outcomes later in life if we have they should recognize, for example, the benefits of resistance training. So everyone should know that even if you're a PE teacher or a consultant or a medic, you should encourage the kids to participate in resistance training, not to maximal effort, I will say, just to be safe. And we have different points, and this is just an example of beginners, intermediate, and experienced and advanced. I will not go more in detail, because this is just a general, the guidelines that we have in the UK, but you can find all this information if you need to apply it in the specific sport on your case, in this one, which is also free access and everyone can access it, so you can have an example of how you can develop the program of resistance training. So let's move now to the development to evaluate to have the talent identification, which is quite complex, and that's from Eisman in the USA, one great consultant now in different academies, and which actually proves that we have so many motor movement competencies and skills that we need to assess, so we can have a robust prediction of the capability, of the abilities of the athletes, so we can be sure if they have the potential. So what we did in a project with Manchester, we tried to develop this talent identification based on specific research program. Obviously, this was private, and that was an example because some of the data, they cannot be published. Because if we publish the model that we use there, Arsenal might see it, Chelsea might see it, they want to use it as well. So we had to keep it quite general when we're using it to the public. So this is a nice program because it actually combines all the focus, small interventions that they did in each one of these stages of the long-term athlete development. So the stages between 8 and 12, they focused mainly to develop the love of the game. So why should I love football? Why to be more romantic and try to have that thirst which they will keep them for the rest of their life? Because the kids are quite adaptable on this stage, and if you put, let's say, the idea inside them that this is a nice game, I love it, and I will do everything that I can, then they will be more consistent in their training. They will be more careful in terms of injuries and follow the guidelines of the coach. So at this stage, it's really important to focus on that. And they gave lots of attention, specifically Gary Neville, for that. Then, most of the academies, they don't focus in education. So we need to focus on the education, both of the coaches, obviously, but also of the athletes. So usually the academies, they're not really developed academies, they say, okay, this is the program, here you go, just do it. No, it doesn't work like that. You need to pass the information, why is this working, why is this important, and what they will achieve with that. Because that's why they will be more consistent and more focused on the specific program. So you need to have education as part of the training program. It's not, okay, I'm designing it, I'm the head, you're the athlete, you're following. It doesn't work like that, specifically for kids, okay? Then we have, this is more specifically for footballers, that's more commercial, because when we're focusing at this stage of life, we have a more advanced educational training for that and routines, which these routines, they help to be consistent and also reach the level of professional level if we can, at least for the academies from Manchester, so they can have the first professional contract, those that developed all the skills. And you can see at this weights they are 16 to 21, way after the peak high velocity. Not even 15 that we're saying the specialization, which the mine started, but that starts at 16 to 21, okay? And the last, we have the development based on the personal specific training for each one of the athletes, which that's common sense now. And we have a long, actually, development of the program even after they achieve the excellence. So the hard part is even if they reach the excellence and they have reached the targets of professional contracts with lots of millions as footballers, then they need to have a long-term plan so they can keep them consistent for that. So talent identification and biobinding, this is some of the projects we're working with Bath. And we have the 3 pillars of competition, strength and conditioning, and talent identification. So based on that, I'm not sure who plays FIFA or PES. Have you ever played Pro Evolution Soccer or FIFA? I hope you did. I was not alone when I was playing so much of that. So based on that, you have the profiles of the athletes. Based on these profiles, you can create and assess all these profiles, even if that's fitness, counter movement jumps, that's really basic fitness tests, that they are field tests. But based on that, we can see the performance and build a profile based on the age of the athletes. And this can become in any sport, actually. And this is the categorization based on the Z scores of under 12s athletes, and these are the components which it seems that this is quite good athlete. Do you believe that what will happen if we adjust for biological age to these performances, to these fitness components? They will go up or down? They will shrink, or they will be even better athletes for under 12s? That's easy.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so we have the different fitness scores for under 12s. Okay, under 12s, and we have counter movement jump, the yo-yo test, 5-meter sprint, 10, 20, 30. And this is the categorization based on their age. If we try to have this categorization of the athletes based on the biological maturation, what will happen to the results? Do you believe that they will shrink or they will be bigger?
They will shrink.
Yeah, they will shrink considerably. And that actually proves why we need to categorize them when we have all these fitness assessments based on biological maturation and not based on age. Because you might have references, we have reference in scientific literature and say, okay, the 20-meter shuttle run performance of 12 years old should be this minutes or this number of shuttles, or the predicted VO2, which is not valid, but let's keep it. Okay, so this categorization is actually misleading, because it doesn't take into account the biological maturation. And we need to find, okay, what's the peak high velocity? How many years away you're from that? And based on that, to categorize you and have this profile which is more relevant. That's a classic mistake usually that happens to basketball, and they see someone who is taller, stronger, putting more points, and after that, what happens to them? They go to the team, the others catch up, they have worse technical skills, and goes to the bench. So that's the end of the story. So let's summarize all the points that we said. I hope I didn't tire you. So biological age is definitely more important than chronological age when we're designing and assessing the skills of the young athletes. The long-term athlete development is important and it can guide for the specific development of the skills, and it is more important to have the development for the better development of the skills based on the maturation and by following the specific LTD of each sport. I gave you just an idea of the general models, but it's more important to have for the specific sport. After that, the partners will say that they need to participate and educate them and engage them in this process. The competitiveness and the professionalism should not be focusing early on, because it actually creates a wrong pattern of development of the skills and also of professional development later on. And more training hours doesn't necessarily, during growth, doesn't necessarily mean that we'll have more champions in the future. We need to find the right time to do the right things. That's the basic things I think we can change mainly in the academies in Greece. And then we need to focus on using exercise, resistance training exercise. There are a lot of guidelines. And also, last but not least, the talent identification is much more valid when we have athletes to be evaluated for a long term, and becomes more specific and valid as we reach adulthood. I think that's for me. If you have any more questions, I would like just to thank the Exeter family, as we call the research family. And if you have any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Yeah?
In my personal experience and from my federation, for the Hellenic Swimming Federation, since we have national races from ages varying from 9 years old until 12, and then we go into the racing ages, as we say them, what would you suggest to the whole federation about your survey and the results?
Yeah, that was the conversation I had also with basketball. Because if you have the games and you need to play the games, if you have the males team and you need to play as a mini team, let's say, in the early stages to compete, then you automatically create early specialization and worse development that can actually happen. So the blame is not obviously on you, it's based on the structure of the whole development. In that case, they could see the competition as a fun or a game, but not to win. So you should avoid telling them, you have the game, you will train for that, you have these meters to complete, that's the performance that you need to have, and we need to achieve these medals. And this will help the academy to grow, or the national team, and satisfy the parents as well. That's a classic misinterpretation that happens. In that case, you need to persuade the rest of the team and the parents that we should not focus in this aspect. We should focus more on the technical aspects, and you should give credit to those that they had the best technical skills during the race, rather than the time instead. So you're actually modifying slightly your model from the competitiveness and the early specialization to the fundamental movement skills, and you reward, even if someone wins the race, you don't reward them because they didn't have good technique, but you reward those that they actually followed the right plan that you gave them based on the specific age or biological age. So this will shift slightly more diplomatically, without conflicts and anything with the parents and the national federations. So you will shift that change towards a better development. And you will not see the results instantly, but you will have that mentality to the whole federation that you actually need to focus on the specific pattern at each stage, so we can have better results when the time comes. And they will come. Because at least in the UK, it was so obvious. When they started the model in 2004 after Athens, and they were not happy with the medals, they said, we need a long-term athlete development for every single sport. In London, we need to have the most gold medals that we ever had. They did it. In Brazil, they had even more than China. If we adjusted based on the size of the country, New Zealand is only the most of it, because they follow the English model, and they have the most long-term athlete development when they pushed at the right time, without early specialization. But they changed the whole of it. Now, in England at least, we're trying to even change based to categorize in the competition that you're saying. You say, when you have the idea of the athlete, of the swimming athlete, someone is 14 years old. You're going in this age category. Now we're trying to change it and say, okay, your peak high velocity or Tanner stage is that, to have like a general rule. You're not going for that competition because you're not mature yet. You'll have to wait, and once you reach it, you will go to the age category. So you cannot change, obviously, the whole system in a night, but once you start using these techniques, then you protect your athletes to develop more. I'm not sure if I answered it. I tried to extend it a bit, but these are some small techniques that we're always trying to give to the coaches and the federations. Yeah?
I think the LKID model is something that everyone wants to follow, but I think it's an utopia, because until this time, in the European Union, in swimming, from 13 years old, are in a high competitive athletes. So.
Do you believe that we should, it depends on the swimming, it depends on the sport. Specialization in swimming might start earlier, based on the competitions, and we should be competitive and have that. But do you believe that we should explicitly focus on competitiveness without focusing on the skills?
But all over the world right now, they want the 13 years old and 14 years old to have the better competition and better development. So how the countries or the national federation make a program about LKID. This is the best. And,
in that, I know you're right. It's quite hard to go in a world when something is so competitive and try to not be competitive. But the changes, I know what you're meaning. You need to focus in each one of the changes that you can do. The biological maturation can give you information for the athletes. So if someone is not ready and he's 13, you cannot push harder because he's not biologically ready. So that's a basic concept of common sense.
This is followed by all over the world until now. I don't think that anyone's followed the LKIG.
I think many follow, and they have many gold medals.
Not in swimming, maybe in academies like football and like professional.
In swimming, I was working with an athlete of a private college in Plymouth, which came fourth in the world. His competition level, it was really hard at the beginning, as you said, but he was focusing so specifically in the routines of the model, so he didn't exclude it completely. So if we're saying to the whole federation, the LTD is an utopia.
I know exactly the system of the
Yeah.
that they want, but they have a fine system
Mm-hmm.
But this is only the greatest guys.
If they're so successful, it's a good example. And we always need to follow the examples of that. I know it's quite hard to change the whole structure of the federation and say not being competitive, but you can still be competitive, take the education or the biological aspects to consider them when you're training or pushing the athletes or designing all the programs, and then adapt them accordingly so you can have a better athletes in the future in the right time.
So we are telling, yes, do as you do right now,
Mm-hmm.
but have in mind this.
At least for now, to have a small step. Because if we totally exclude and say, no, this cannot happen, we're not progressing, obviously. But if we say we can do some small steps, what steps can I learn from that? Even if that's biological age, do I assess? Do I know what my athletes are doing? Do I know the level or not? How can I adapt it based on that? Do I know the psychological development, which at least for both for swimming athletes and other athletes is the most important predictor of later on competitiveness?
It's nice, it's nice to know that,
Mm-hmm.
and have it, and work, having on our mind this,
Mm-hmm.
and try to change something if
There are really small steps. The change will not come at one night, as I said. So even small changes, by understanding the scientific evidence and say, yes, we have this reality, which is hard. We're following so we can have the result that we're wanting. Sometimes we're having it or them. But for the long-term point, and what will be that, that's something more important that we need to focus more. So we can do some small changes at each one of us based on the position that we have.
Άλλη ερώτηση. The real life Dimitri is worse in gymnastics.
Yeah.
Okay.
The gymnastics, you have subgrowth, and there are lots of evidence the hormonal changes are.
How we can persuade it? How we can work with it? There's no way. Ari, please explain the Youth Olympic Games. The Youth Olympic
Yes, it is.
Games.
Okay, I am convinced because I teach also this model, and that we have to follow this theory because we don't have still scientific evidence to prove and to convince the parents and the trainers and to educate to follow this theory. The problem is that the International Olympic Committee organized Youth Olympic Games at the age of 16 or 17 years old. So you know very well that records, for example, pole vault, more than 550. So it's not 550. You cannot achieve. You cannot reach these records. I think that following a long pathway like this. I know that I think that you are now like a prophet and you try to convince the people to follow Jesus. Okay, and but we have. You said already that we have to try to
do small
step by
steps.
step,
Mm-hmm.
start to investigate. So in a few years we're going to have evidence-based data. So it will be easier to make them follow us.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing that we have, I would like to make clear to the parents, because I see that we have also parents here from different sports, is that you said that we have to follow different
Models based on the sport.
expose children to different kinetic patterns.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is a little bit confused because here in Greece, in the difficult financial situation that we live, the Greek family cannot afford two different academies.
Yeah.
So I think that the solution is that we have to
Within the same academy to implement different.
to make special programs in order to give them different the basic kinetic elements, and then to go to the sports, specific sport.
Not even in the UK they go to different clubs, but within the same club they have one day at least per week, so they can train different training, different skills based on other sports that are relevant with the specific sport they're developing, the techniques. So the solution is not just to attend two different clubs, but within the same one, at least once per week, to have different skills, even if that's anything else.
Which is relative to the basic kinetic pattern, right?
Based the kinetic pattern of the specific sport.
Okay, thank you anyway for the
No, thanks.
presentation. Congratulations.
Thank you.
We continue.
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me for this lecture. Today we are going to cover a very large topic, and I tried to compress it. Instead of 7-8 hours, I do this in, let's say, 40 minutes. I'm trying to introduce some basic concept in neuromuscular profiling. The monitoring of readiness and fatigue, and the monitoring of performance. We are going to start with 3 questions for you before starting with the lecture. So, the question will be done at the beginning now of the lecture and at the end to check the differences in response. First questions.
Done with the little joysticks you have, right?
Yeah, you have the joy. Okay, perfect. You will notice that during the lecture, the term force will be mainly used instead of the term strength. What is the reason, in your opinion? First answer. Force is the correct term to be used when discussing biomechanics, as it represents the physics quantity. Force is more appropriate because it is a scalar quantity, or because I am a Star Wars fan.
Yes.
Still 0 responses. You need to respond. It's not working?
Τα είχαμε ανάψει, Γιάννη. Τα είχαμε ανάψει.
Still 0, but it's not working?
First we press channel, and then we press...
Channel.
Τι channel το έχεις, Γιάννη? Ένα.
41 λέει.
Channel και πατήστε το 1. Πατήστε channel και μετά το 1.
Ναι, μετά.
Αυτό πρέπει να κάνει sync. Να κάνει πέρα.
This is the dark side of the force. Which
Εδώ έχει...
never happened, this?
No.
No?
But everything will work out. Ciao Sardiname.
Αλλά τι πατάω. Σαν δεν έλεγα πρώτα.
Αυτό πρέπει. Κάτσε να κλείσω την παρουσίαση και να την ξανακλείσω μια φορά.
Στο τέτοιο. Πού είναι το τέτοιο? Περιμένετε λίγο. Κάφτε και ας την παρουσίαση.
They can try?
No, it's not working, so I guess you have to carry on.
Would you like to do it by hand? Or no? No, go.
It's not working?
It's not working, so
Okay, it's not working, but the questions are here, so you can answer, and we can discuss it at the end of the question. You can write if you have a pen and a paper. But now it's working.
I don't know. You don't see big ones. Yeah. But
It's
I know the
working.
first one. The responses are coming.
yep.
Yes.
Working. Okay.
Please.
Okay.
Everybody has one, correct? Yes. More than 14.
We are more than 13. How many? Okay. Can I go to the next question? Okay, this is the first one. No Star Wars fun here. Okay. 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 This is the. We will compare these answers with the answers at the end of the lecture. Okay. This is the second question. Why, in the process of neuromuscular profiling, we are going to collect kinetics and not kinematics variables? Kinetics variables provide more information on the function of the neuromuscular system and performance output. B, kinematics variables are not properly understood in neuromuscular profiling. C, kinematics are only useful when analyzing dynamic actions. It's not working anymore. Because the count is, the 22 is, is from the previous. Okay. I think.
Let's move forward. Jan, the basic.
It's blocked.
So, this is the second question.
Yeah? No, it's a. Oh.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, open. You need to do this for each.
I think so.
Uh-huh.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Because it hadn't computed.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was, when we were testing it, we left it in the middle.
Okay. Okay. It's quite easy.
It's only one more question.
5 people more. The last one? No. Okay. We can move. Interesting. Okay. Third question. In the process of testing and evaluating athletes, players in a practical environment, there seems to be too much effort put in collecting general metrics rather than specific metrics. Are you familiar with the concept of KPIs? How would you choose what to measure and when? First answer, yes. KPIs represents the pillars of a modern evidence-based evaluation approach. Second, yes, KPIs need to be identified based on the individual age of the athlete player. C, no, I don't think KPIs are important based on the actual evidences.
Are they coming in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I assume you already know the meaning of KPIs. We will discover during the lecture. The main goal of this question is to engage more the audience.
Explain how you translate KPIs.
Yeah, yeah. During the lecture, I will. Yeah. Okay, 21 again. Perfect. Okay. Okay, finished. Let's start with the lecture. So, this is another task for you. Look at this slide and at this specific picture, because this is going to be probably the most important of the lecture. I want you to look at this for 1 minute, and at the end of the lecture, I would like to know how you interpret this. You can see 3 boxes: data, information, and knowledge. And properly understanding this is fundamental for anyone involved in working with athletes, whether they are professional or amateur. Pay attention at the colors as well. Take notes, pictures, okay? And I want to know your interpretations at the end of the lecture. Can I move forward? Okay, perfect. What is neuromuscular profiling? Let's try to define it. Neuromuscular profiling can be defined as a systematic approach to the evaluation and interpretation of kinetics variables and neuromuscular properties of an athlete player's performance. It's not a case that here we have a picture with an athlete performing the counter movement jump, and I will explain you later why. If you remember the second question, I asked why we collect kinetics variables and not kinematics variable. The difference between kinetics and kinematics is quite simple. Kinetics is a branch of mechanics, and it explains the causes of motion. It's a description that includes consideration of force as the cause of motion. This is one of the books that I suggest to read to anyone involved in sports science and medicine, which is called Neuromechanics of Human Movement from Roger and Oka. It's a difficult textbook, but can change your vision and life as well. Kinematics is a branch of mechanics, but it describes the motion of objects relative to some frame of reference. You can see the picture here. With kinetics, we are interested in the forces that cause motion. In kinematics, we are interested in the angles, position, velocity, acceleration. Kinematics variables are more interesting to collect when analyzing how an athlete moves in terms of technique and other biomechanical parameters. Kinetics variables are fundamental if we want to understand the performance output, which is different. kinetics variables, and neuromuscular properties that we are going to explain later, but are related to muscle physiology, contraction, activation, and coordination, are related to the activation level of individual muscle, the timing of recruitment and activation of individual muscle, which is very, very important, the symmetry between sides, and the inter and intramuscular coordination. Someone is, I don't know if you can see because probably it's, but this is a model. I don't know if someone is familiar with this model. This is from Jens Bangsbo, which is a professor at the University of Copenhagen in exercise physiology. He works both from a scientific aspects and from a practical aspect. He has worked in football as well. Has worked with Juventus in the 90s in Italy as well. And this is called holistic model of the determinants of sports performance. If you are interested, I can send you this presentation so that you can have a look at this model. I show you this because sports performance and the performance outcomes are very multifactorial. So we have a lot of determinants, tactical, technical, physical, psychological, social, internal factors, sex, age, maturation, external factors like temperature, humidity, altitude, field condition, nutrition. And we need to choose, based on the type of sport and based on the scientific evidence, which kind of determinants are more appropriate for a specific activity. This is the testing, monitoring, testing process. This works both for individual athletes and for team sports. This is a model that normally we use in team environment, where the testing phase is done in pre-season, before the season starts, to take baseline measurements for each player and each athlete. Based on these results, we are able to provide the right training interventions for each player, for performance, for recovery, for injury prevention. I don't like to use this term, but I use it because it's widely used, but I prefer to use injury reduction, rehabilitation, and individualization. The process of testing, again, is to understand how our interventions have whether or not increased or decreased the KPIs during the season. What are the KPIs? And this is the question that we had before. Definition of testing. It's a process of evaluating the physical condition of an athlete and his level of performance. Monitoring is different because it's the process of checking how training loads is influencing performance, recovery, injury risk, and rehabilitation. And the KPI stands for Key Performance Indicators. It is a quantifiable measure used to evaluate the success of an organization, team, athlete, etc., in meeting objectives for performance. So each sport, has its key performance indicator. So for basketball, we have some KPIs, and in 100 meter in track and field, we have different KPI. Assessing force asymmetry. The first question was why, in your opinion, I'm going to use the term force rather than strength during the lecture. Force is a vector quantity. It is basically a straight line push or pull. It is a mechanical interaction between an object and its surroundings. And the unit of measurement is, for force is the Newton. This is a graphical representation in which we have a person in real life, okay? This is the transformation, the identification of the system, as it's called in biomechanics, okay, with line and angles. And in the third, we can see also the force acting on the system and its surroundings. Strength. Strength is not a physics quantity. It's the expression of the neuromuscular system ability. And it represents a biomotor ability and a skill. Because fundamentally, strength is a skill because we have to learn how to become strong. So when discussing about biomechanics, about how the force is produced, we need to use the term force rather than strength. How we are using? For neuromuscular profiling, the two main technologies that are widely used now in professional sports are dual force plates and EMG. What is the main advantage of using the dual force plates? The classic, do you have any experience by using force platforms? Okay. A force plate is a platform measuring the total force applied on the top of the surface, providing a measurement of the total vertical force, an average of both limbs. Dual force, through the use of two separate force plates, one for each limb, can provide a more precise evaluation of kinetics differences and asymmetries between left and right side, as well as a deeper level of analysis and understanding of an athlete performance. Why, in your opinion, by using the dual force plates, we can go deeper into the analysis of an athlete performance? By using the two plates and having the data for left and right respect then the average of both.
In most cases, we tend to use one side of ours more frequently than the other side when it comes to sports.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, even myself, when I'm going into a tackle, I usually use my right side, even though it's not the best option depending on the case.
Okay.
So by using something like that, I can definitely measure the strength.
Okay.
And also probably, seeing what's the best side or how I can involve myself as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Because as I've seen from the model before, there was a jump also as well.
Mm-hmm.
So this also shows the force we have by the moment we apply when we actually reach the floor or when we reach the plates. So this could also present injuries as well.
Yeah. I will give you an example. Athletes have a high capacity of compensating and using compensatory strategies, even in presence of an injury. So let's say an example of an athlete recovering from an ACL surgery. So with a normal force plate, with a single plate, we can monitor the rehabilitation process. And sometimes we look, let's say, at the jump height. If we have a pre-injury level of height, we test the players to check when he return close to the baseline pre-injury. Okay, we have an athlete that is close to the jump height pre-injury, and we can say, okay, it's ready to start training again. Okay. By using a dual force plates, maybe we can see that the jump height is close to the baseline level, pre-injury level, but he is pushing more with the uninjured side respect that the side where he had the surgery. And you can easily understand that this compensatory strategies is a characteristic of a high-performance athletes. And this way we can understand how to progress rehabilitation. This is just one of the cases. Especially in sport. So we are talking about a practical environment, and we are taking the force plates outside of the lab. 90% of football teams in Premier League and in second in Championship League in UK are using regularly force platform monitoring with dual force plates, and they mainly use vertical jump. So we are talking about one-dimension force plates, because the classic force plates from the lab are measuring forces in 3 dimensions, horizontal forces, okay, or shear force, and vertical forces. Now we are talking only about vertical components. This is the process of, again, testing, training, and monitoring, and follow-ups. With the testing at the beginning, we're testing kinetic variables, asymmetries, eccentric and concentric rate of force development, and coordination. Based on this data, look at this and put this in relation with the first slide that I showed you. Data, information, knowledge. And try to connect the dots. Training, individualized intervention based on this data, and monitoring follow-ups to check if our training interventions are effective. This is an example of how dual force plates can provide us with information about asymmetries between left and right side. Here we have, these are the results of a counter movement jump of a basketball player, and we have the concentric mean force asymmetry in the concentric phase with the percentage between left and right side. So here we have an high asymmetries on the and a shift on the left side. This is the eccentric contraction of the movement with the asymmetry between left and right. This is the peak force at takeoff phase of the jump. And this is the asymmetry at landing, which is very, very important, especially for knee health. Okay, this is the funniest part. What is this? It's very, very easy. Never seen this type of graph? What are the variables represented in this? What we have plotted here? Here and here, the 2 axes. It's one of the most important aspects of the analysis of performance. It's simple. This is a force time curve. This is a force time curve. We have force in Newton here on the vertical axis, and time on the horizontal axis is fundamental because movement, occur over time. So having the ability to understand how movement is occurring over time is fundamental for understanding performance. Okay, this is a force time curve, but which type of movement, this shape of the curve is very important. And this is from a specific movement. What is in your opinion? Then I need one volunteer here. I heard someone. You are the volunteer? Ah, okay, okay, perfect. Oh, okay. If you are able to
Do what?
to analyze this, yes, okay.
It's a volunteer. It's the same what to do.
Okay, we are going to represent here that because you need to learn. The most important part is that you need to learn how to analyze a force time curve. It's fundamental. Okay. This is a counter movement jump. This is the shape of a counter movement jump. I assume that you are familiar with the difference between a counter movement jump and a squat jump. With the counter, we use the counter movement jump in sport because it's quite easy to learn for all the athletes except football players, which are another categories of human beings. Yeah, it's true. There are two categories: all football players and all the rest of athletes. And this is a counter movement jump, and the most important thing is that it involves the stretch shortening cycle, because with the squat jump we need to jump from this position, from a static position, to check the explosiveness of the legs, of the lower legs. The counter movement jump involves the stretch shortening cycle, okay, which is more useful for performance measurement. Okay, one volunteer. I have to choose?
Can I? No?
No, you can.
I said I have volunteer.
Yeah, but I need some input from you.
Ah, I have none. Except you want me to jump.
Okay.
Let's run it. See that jump.
Okay. Okay.
He's better.
Yeah? Oh.
He's more athletic.
But we don't need to do anything athletic. Only. Okay, perfect. Okay, this is a force time curve. This is the force time curve. Okay, here we have the force, and here we have the time. We divide this curve in 5 points. Okay. Are you familiar with the counter movement jump? Yeah? Okay. Okay, let's see. What is the counter movement jump? Let me see.
Like that.
Oh, okay, perfect. Are you able to understand the phases of the counter movement jump here? So all the movements that you perform during the task are represented here.
Okay. So I have to force more than.
This is the start of the movement. What do you think?
Yes.
Okay.
No, the zero. The 0 point.
0 is here.
Yes.
Okay. Here is, let's say, 1,000 Newton.
Okay.
Okay. The A point is the point where the initiation of the so-called unweighted phase, okay, where we are going to fall down below the system weight. System weight is the term that is used in biomechanics because we are over 0 is the line of the trace of the platforms with no interaction, okay. 1,000 is with the people stepping on the platform, and it is called the system weight. Okay, this is the first part when the system is unloaded, okay, because we are putting less force on the ground. Okay, the second point is the B point, is when the ground reaction force return to the system weight, okay, when we are starting to push again at the same level. This is a spike now. The C point is the end of the eccentric phase and the start of the propulsive. So when we start to push. At the same time, this C is the most important point, because at the same time the C is also the peak negative displacement of the center of mass of the jumpers, okay? And the point in time where there is the transitions of the center of mass from negative to positive. D point is the peak velocity of the center of mass during jumping. Then we assist to a fall into the line, into the force. E is when the system and the ground reaction force falls again below the system weight. And the F is easy. What is the F?
We come again in the ground.
But now we are going to zero here. What is? Okay, this is the takeoff when we are leaving the platform. Okay, and here are the peak landing force. Okay, but the most important determinants of the counter movement jump are this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 points. Understanding how the force is expressed over time is fundamental, because you can easily understand how the athlete is working both in the concentric and in eccentric phase. Okay, thank you. Do you have question of this? Okay. There is something that you didn't understand? At the end of the lecture, maybe. Okay. For assessing the neuromuscular properties, we normally use surface electromyography. Someone have experience in using EMG? Okay. EMG stands for surface electromyography. Now, the use of EMG is becoming more popular, even in a practical setting, because there has been a reduction in costs, more user-friendly data visualization and software, because a few years ago, EMG was only relegated into the lab. Now we have a lot of options, more practical, wireless sensors that you can put with no wires on the muscle. We have wearable pants with EMG sensor embedded into the textile that we can use. And it is mainly used in neuromuscular profiling for checking the intermuscular coordination. What is the difference between intramuscular and intermuscular? The intermuscular coordination refers to how well we are able to coordinate the different muscle involved in a specific movement. The intramuscular coordination refers to how we are able to coordinate and fire the single muscle. And it's determined by synchronization of motor unit, the muscle recruitment, and the rating of discharge, rate coding. This is a raw signal of an EMG analysis. This is a tibialis anterior left and right, and this is a medial gastrocnemius left and right. Why is useful for coaches and scientists to assess intermuscular coordination? because we can measure muscle activity around one joint region or one side of the body in single test activities. This is an example of a report of a coordination test. We can check the difference in timing of activation, the firing patterns. We can see the time it takes a muscle to start firing, so the on-off characteristics of a prime movers, and coordination of different muscles. You can check here. Here we have the time, and this is the activation. Okay, and we can see the timing and compare different muscle when contraction starts. And we have the value here. We have mean value, which is the average value of the amplitude of the signal, the peak, which is the peak value of the mg. The most important is the input percentage, which is the relative contribution of each muscle when the summation of all recorded muscle activity is defined as 100%. So we can see if there are some deficiencies in the kinetic chain, and some muscle are not properly firing, and we can decide how to properly address this by training and maybe recovery technique. Assessing the force development and expression. In the last year, there has been a growing interest, especially in also a lot of new research, investigating the importance of the eccentric rate of force development. Why? There is one recent study of Lafay and Wagner that shows that the way to jump high requires a motor strategy based on the optimization of the stretch shortening cycle function by increasing the eccentric rate of force development and minimizing the eccentric time, which results in higher level of force and improvement of the vertical jump performance. We were only looking at concentric rate of force development years ago. Moreover, this new method to record the rate of force development seems to be a better predictor of jumping performance by summarizing the ability of the muscle tendon system to store efficiently elastic energy and to release elastic energy, as well as activating the stretch reflex. How many of you are familiar with, someone is working with daily with physical and strength and conditioning with athletes? But, okay. How many of you, are you implementing some sort of, how to say, eccentric based training or, okay.
Just some plyometrics, but not too much.
Okay.
Because I have swimmers, so
Okay. Okay. Okay.
we don't do a lot of plyometrics.
Okay. 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 Monitoring readiness and fatigue. This is probably one of the most important paper that I suggest you to read, showing the importance of using counter movement jump for monitoring fatigue, because counter movement jump is very easy. With 3 trials, you can measure even weekly, 2 times a week. Let's say in a team environment where they are under pressure in terms of time, they don't have time to do things. So using the counter movement jump, let's say the day after the rest day, 2 days after the game, and the day before the game, they help to understand fatigue and making better decision on how to let player perform or rest and recovery. But this paper is important because it introduces new elements for assessing neuromuscular fatigue with the counter movement jump, because it investigates two types of variables, typical and alternative variables. The typical variables are the ones that are being used since many years in understanding fatigue and are related to the power, okay? The peak power, the mean power, and we use this to monitor fatigue by looking at decreasing in power output during the week. They found that the timing of expression of force, production of force, is also important in the determination of neuromuscular fatigue. Not only the power output, but the strategies that athletes use to jump. These alternative variables are being identified in force at zero. This is very complex. The force at zero velocity, which is the force exerted at the end of the counter movement, where the jump transitions from eccentric to concentric movement, and velocity is at zero in this case. Another important parameter is the duration of the eccentric phase, the time required to perform the eccentric phase in the CMJ, the concentric duration, time required, the total duration, and the average mean eccentric and concentrics, and the power over time. So they introduce the time variables. These are other two papers that I suggest you to read from the same group of researchers. This one and this one that has been done on elite snowboard cross athletes, still with counter movement jump. Last one is the monitoring of performance. Here, today with the dual force systems, we have the possibility to obtain immediate data. Perform the test, 1 minute, and you already have all the data available. 5, 6, 10 years ago, the process was completely different. And after testing, we had to wait at least 1 hour and a half to obtain the data for all the players. So it was not so practical, especially for team sports. Now we have immediately information on the mean force in concentric phase, the eccentric average force, the height of the jump, the peak power, in a very easy visualization way. Okay, this is a model that I applied for, is a, how to say, periodization scheme for the testing process. This is the pre-season periodization of the testing. The tests are performed daily, and the profiling and screening is done for neuromuscular profiling, performance analysis, and injury risk screening. The creation of a baseline for each player. Baseline is fundamental because with baseline you have data at the beginning of preparation, and you have also useful data in case of injury. And creation of individual risk profiling. For monitoring in pre-season, we are looking for the effect on short-term adaptation, because in team sports, especially in football, we have in Europe 6-7 weeks available for preparation before season. Fatigue, so acute response to training load, and the effect of potential rehab protocols. This is done in pre-season. Once the season has started, the tests are being done weekly, normally once a week or 2 times a week, depending on the level of the team, the staff available. Because let's say Benfica, just as an example, has a performance lab with 15 people only working for the testing in the testing lab. Other teams don't have this type of approach, so it depends. The testing is done for performance. This case to check long-term adaptation and effectiveness of training intervention, because we need to maintain a stable level of performance during the season. And monitoring for injury risk, fatigue, and rehab in case of a return to play for an injured player. Okay. Practical application in team sports, the type of testing done. This is mainly with EMG. We use shorts with embedded EMG sensors to check quadriceps, hamstrings, and glutes muscles, 6 channels. We measure, as a general profiling, movement proficiency, so a baseline gait testing. I don't know if you are familiar with the functional movement screen. A lot of teams provide them. I'm not a big fan because, in my opinion, before checking some movements in an athlete, like an overhead squat or something, you need to check the gait, which is the most fundamental movement patterns. The overhead squat is not a basic movement pattern, it's a skill. So people need to learn how to squat with a bar overhead. Baseline muscle activation testing for some muscle like the glutes and hamstrings. And for strength and speed, we perform EMG testing in back squat and Romanian deadlift. And for speed, we check acceleration, change of direction, and repeated sprint ability. And we look at how the muscles are active during this task on the field. Okay. Now, at the end of the lecture, we are going to answer again at all the 3 questions. I don't know if we need to...
Let's see.
Okay, this is the first one. And then we are going to compare first answers and final answers. Okay, you can answer at the first one. Force, remember the slide. $14? 22. 21. Okay, 21. So there is no name on the answer, so no problem. Privacy is guaranteed. Okay, 3 people are not, okay. Okay, maybe. Okay, the comparison is at the end.
People are believers now.
This is the answer.
The comparison is at the end.
Yes.
No, this is the new chart.
The comparison between the first and...
This is the new one.
Okay.
So you still have some Star Wars fan.
Yeah, okay. No, but how we can see at the end the comparison between first.
We read backwards.
Ah, okay. Okay, second. Kinetics variables. Okay. You already know the questions. Just answer. The last one? Okay. Good. Nice discussion. Third question. Okay. Okay. Good. Okay, let's go back to this one. Okay. Most 61% responded A. Okay. Which is correct because we discussed about biomechanics and kinetics variables. So force is the correct term to be used when discussing biomechanics. If we were discussing, let's say, about strength training and the best methods for improving strength, the correct terms is strength, but in this case, force is the correct term to be used. It seemed an obvious question, but this is not the case, because sometimes there are some 33% that is a scalar quantity, has no direction, force. Okay, so this is not good because force is a vector quantity. And yes, I am a Star Wars fan, but it's not the right answer. Okay, second. Good. There is a 39% answering that kinematics are only useful when analyzing dynamic actions. Someone that responded the C, want to tell me the reason? Okay. Why are only useful when analyzing dynamic actions? Firstly, what is kinematics, if you remember the slide?
Kinematics is in the page. We saw that in the right position, the people that forces the. No, I'm not going to explain. Kinematic is when I put force.
This is a trap answer. Because
Kinematic is when I put force.
No, this is kinetics. Why it's wrong? But it has been this answer because kinematics are only useful when analyzing dynamic actions. But kinematics is only dynamic action because it's the description of motion. There is no kinematics in a static position. It's movement over time. Acceleration, velocity. % answer, kinematics variables are not properly understood in neuromuscular profiling, which is one of the answers which is not correct. But kinetics variables, this is the question. Why we are going to collect kinetics? Because in neuromuscular profiling, we are going to collect performance metrics, how an athlete is producing force. So for this reason, kinetics is much more important than kinematics for this reason. Okay, last one. This is very interesting that 61% has responded B, probably influenced from the first lecture. Why, in your opinion, key performance indicators need to be identified based on the individual age of the athlete player? There is a different demand if the sport is the same.
I reckon it's the first one, because we actually need to see the trend and then break down and see the root cause of what's happening. Do a further analysis. We can definitely use KPIs if we want to analyze the same age players and their performance, etc. But that's a subsequent result. The general thing that we use the KPIs is to measure the general performance and the trend.
The specific performance of a specific sport.
Team, for example,
Yeah.
and then break it down to
Okay, let's say the process is you have a basketball player and a sprint track and field athlete in, let's say, 100 meter. You know that key performance indicators are not the same for the sport. So if we have to test, let's say, repeated sprint ability in basketball and change of direction and intermittent test like, let's say, yo-yo or in football, in track and field, in sprint athletes, we have different type of key performance indicators that are specific to the sport. Then we can discuss in terms of age, individual age, when is the moment to start testing some key performance indicator. Yeah, but key performance indicators are, and there is a
variation depending on the elements you are combining.
Yeah. And of course, we need to check all the evidence-based elements available in the literature to understand the needs of a determined sport. Yeah.
Can I just bring an example based on the soccer that you mentioned
Yeah.
before, that it's one of the most famous sports? For example, how many times a specific athlete or the team reached the goal area?
Yeah.
How many scores they actually accomplished?
Mm-hmm.
And they can combine that towards the time they had or something else. They need to be, and then they can compare that to the same KPIs compared to a different game they had.
Okay.
They can use them for statistics afterwards, but it's the general performance.
Okay. Yeah.
And we can see also the impact as well. It's a very good way to see the impact of an athlete when it comes to a general team performance. But that's of course something for different level clubs and trainings.
Okay. Now I want someone want to tell me something about this slide, because the two most important things for me today is that you properly understand this and the force time curve. What is your interpretation of this picture? Let's say this is related to the process of collecting data on players and athletes. Testing, evaluating, analysis. Because there is a trend today, especially both in the practical setting, so teams, federation, and also in sports science lab.
Collect data without information. Collect many data.
Mm-hmm.
But then you don't have the knowledge to explain.
Nothing to do with that.
Yeah. Today, sometimes technology is progressing every day. We assist every day to a new company claiming that we have the right system for prevent injuries, for improve performance. Okay. What I teach every time is we need to learn how to recognize useful and useless technologies. Technologies is important today, but is a good help for athletes and coaches and scientists. But not all technologies are equal. And not always high-end technologies mean useful technology. So sometimes there is a trend. The trend is to collect data just to show to be smarter than others. So I'm collecting this, I'm doing this. But when collecting data, these dots are black, gray, with no colors, because are just numbers. If we know how to interpret and analyze this dot, we can obtain information, and we can start to make these dots color. Okay? We transform this number in, but there is a third step, the final step. Okay, we analyze data, but we need to build knowledge from this data, and the knowledge is, this is why it's important, the model that I showed you, the holistic model of the determinants of sports performance, because we need to be able to connect all the dots to have an overall picture of how this athlete is functioning and what are all the determinants of his performance, and how we can make proper intervention to improve the athlete from a holistic point of view, which is performance, which is the ability to recover quickly, the lifestyle outside of the training ground, which is important as well, and we need to beat the culture on this. Why? I told you before that we have two categories, football players and all the other athletes, because what you do outside of the training ground is probably more important of what you do into the training ground for training. So this is just a practical tips. 4 years ago, one friend of mine from Canada is a very famous performance coach, came to Italy for the role of director of performance of one important football teams in Serie A. He started to bring the North American way of organizing players in Italy. He started to monitor the sleep of the players. He started to monitor the nutrition, all the life of the players, 24 hours, with wearable tech. After 2 or 3 months, all the players started to make pressure on the club to put the guy is not working anymore at this team, but he's a very successful because he has worked with the national team, the German national team. Now he's working with the US national team. And so this is the most important thing. And understanding, remember, the force time curve in general is essential if you want to analyze performance, because having data already analyzed is good, but understanding what the science behind is more important, because it can open up your and widen your vision on performance. If you have any question on this curve. Okay, so all is clear. Okay, I hope you are able to analyze the force time curve.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your attention. If anyone is interested in a copy of the presentation,
We have their email, so we can email them.
yeah, this is the website. You can find all the contacts there.
Questions?
Any questions?
Yes, I have questions.
Okay.
Antonio, congratulations. I have one question. You know that we're a scientific center, high performance center. We work, we evaluate performance in young athletes, and I would like to share with you information. We have a different procedure to measure the prevention of injuries. We use a specific monitoring system. So we have the everyday load, the psychological condition, how many hours they sleep.
It's the subjective questionnaire?
Yes,
okay.
Like the RP.
Yeah.
Also, we agree with the trainer to have a specific fatigue index correlated to sport-specific performance.
Okay.
For example, in volleyball team, we use counter movement jump. So we have the load. So we have acute load, chronic load. So we have a fatigue index, and then also we have to compare or to correlate. It's much better to correlate the counter movement jump performance in specific periods.
Yeah.
For example, if they have a camp, so we can measure before, after the camp,
After the camp.
The training load. So we can use very useful information.
Yeah.
Because all this is nice, but they are very expensive, and you have to work many hours.
No, it's not expensive.
It's not expensive.
Absolutely. This is why when I use a lot of technology for money. This is just one part. This is just one part. And the reason why I decided to talk about this specific dual force plates is because the costs are lowering. Anyone can afford now. Even a private, let's say, I don't know if you know that this system is called ForceDex. They are from England. It's one biomechanist and one sports scientist. They are produced. If you are not able to afford, the most important thing, to buy their force platforms, you can only buy the software and use it, let's say, with the Pasco plates, which are 400, You can buy 2 Pasco plates and use it with the ForceDex, ForceDex is used by 90% of football teams in Premier League, but they are not using the Pasco, they are using but this is very, very affordable. EMG now we can use the wearable pants with sensor inside. They are validated. They are called Myontech. And they are very simple because they are fast. You don't need to prepare the skin. You put the shorts, and you have 6 channels in quadriceps, hamstrings, and glutes. These are the most affordable technologies. Other type of technologies are still expensive for the average people, unless you have a large amount of athletes and a big business, so they can be used. Like, let's say, another fundamental type of technologies that I use is the pressure measurement, the force pressure, the pressure platform measurement, which is fundamental. And if you visit the website, you can find a blog section, and there is a recent article I wrote about the difference between force and pressure, because sometimes there is some misconceptions about the difference between force and pressure, and they can be integrated. But this is more expensive. I using sensorized insoles directly into the shoes, so you can check what happens into the shoes when contacting the ground. But these are still expensive, more than, let's say, 10,000, and these are still expensive. Whether a force deck software you can buy for 1,000, you can buy a license and use with force plates. There are also other technologies expensive, like TMG. I don't know if you are aware of the tensiomyography. Tensiomyography, in my opinion, is not good for weekly and normal monitoring, because it takes at least 20 minutes for player to test all the muscle. So in football, normally you can perform one test of all the players at the beginning of the season, and you can check the time of contraction, the contractile properties of each muscle, and then 2 or 3 follow-ups during the season, let's say before Christmas, another in March, and another follow-up at the end of the season. I did this for some football teams But for continuous monitoring, understanding the neuromuscular fatigue with counter movement jump is essential, because today using only GPS tracking is not, it's giving only one part of the equation, in my opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
We have a question. You think that the CMJ and the EMG, could you apply to any sport?
The same?
The CMG?
Ah, okay. As a monitoring tool?
Yes. To any sport?
A marathon runner, I don't think is. I prefer to use it in field ground-based activities. I prefer, because yes, there is an involvement in swimming of the posterior chain, sure, but the pattern is different. You are not working against gravity, so the mechanics, so in rowing, rowing can be used.
Are you doing EMG to any athlete?
EMG or?
No, EMG now.
For me, it's providing a lot of information. The way I use it is depending on the time available. So if I'm working with one individual athlete, I have all the time to assess every.
Are you doing EMG in the core, abdominals, spinal?
I'm doing the back test normally. I don't know if you are familiar with. I personally use Noraxon, which is probably the best system from USA, because they have an integrated platform. The software is called MyoResearch, and you can integrate and synchronize in the same time EMG, pressure, platform force, inertial sensor for motion capture, so for kinematics, and they have some predefined protocol into the software that can guide you in, normally this is called the back endurance test, the Sorensen test, to check the shift in frequency of the median frequency to check fatigue, the endurance.
Where is the veneer? Where is the veneer? Because we have in EMG here with biotech. Is the same?
It's integrated into the isokinetic?
Yes, isokinetic.
Uh-huh.
But it also works separated, isolated. You don't have to use only connected with biotech, synchronized.
But it's wired.
Four channels.
It's wired.
No, takes
needles.
How do you call it? Not needles. Paddles. Pads. Sorry.
Yes,
Yeah,
it's
but
wired, not Wi-Fi. It's not
no, but there are wires, so it's wireless.
wires. There is wires.
Ah, okay,
No
okay.
action has with wireless.
Ah, okay, okay. Now is wireless.
You use pads, no needles.
No, absolutely. I'm not a doctor. No.
Pads.
Yeah. Surface electromyography.
Is it reliable?
It's validated. Also, the wearable pants are being validated. They are produced by a Finnish company, which is called Myontech. It's most useful for Myontech. Yeah, it's most useful for. Now they are working more in ergonomics. But they started as a sports science company, and they have these shorts with 6 channels, quadriceps, hamstring, and glutes, and you can use it. Should have been. I didn't think about bringing one shorts here because it will. No.
Any other questions?
Maybe next time.
I'd like to help the conversation, the discussion. So it is a kind of specificity of training. For example, counter movement jump counts lateral forces and not horizontal. So, for example, if you want to evaluate runners or not runners, for example, fencers or swimmers.
It's another type.
I think it's closer to use long jump, for example, than counter movement jump. For rowers, they don't have the intensity of the rowing kinetic pattern is they don't use the stretch shortening cycle with short time.
Yeah, but because they need the muscle endurance, so.
Yes, it's another kind of force. So they use more the leg press.
Yeah.
So you can use force plate. So you can use all the deadlift with isometric conditions. So you have
the isometric mid-tick pull.
Yes, or
squat.
Isometric squat. So you have exactly what they need. So we try to follow this kind of ideas.
Yeah.
For example, in order to go as close to the kinetic pattern, in order to have useful and reliable estimation and measures and assessments. This is our mentality.
You never use the because I noticed that into the lab you never use. There is a reason why you don't use pressure measurement as well.
We want to buy the pressure machine, but
what do we have? Like pressure?
No, pressure platform.
What is pressure platform? We have a mobile force plate.
No, force plates is giving force.
Yes.
Pressure is giving how the foot is pressing on the ground. Pressure platform is another type of. No, this is not my laptop. Okay, no.
You mean something like palmatograph?
No.
The
palmatograph.
pedobarometer. pedobarograph. It's called baropodometry, foot pressure mapping. It's the footprint.
Yes, I know. It's I call it pelmato. Yes, okay.
But
No, we never use
I think the pressure platform gives you the force, correct?
But it's different because pressure is
Gives you
force,
and the force.
is force divided per unit area. It's different. Force, with force, you know how much force you are exerting into the platform that have 4 strain gauge sensor. With pressure, you have a different type of measurement. They don't measure. If you want to, you need to put your weight, but they don't measure your weight.
That's easy to do also.
No. Pressure platform, no. Pressure platform is giving, it's not related to pressure because it's a force, still a force measurement, but divided per unit area. So you, with force, you don't know how your foot is interacting with the ground. You know only how much force you are exerting into the ground. But you don't know if you are exerting more forces with your forefoot, with your metatarsal, with your heels.
Correct, you don't.
With pressure, you have information. You have a map with how you are loading. Let's say there are some sports that, especially in the United States, there is a high amount of fifth metatarsal fracture, especially in NFL, in football.
We can get the same information with gait analysis, with the cameras. Gait analysis, you see we have the system.
Yeah, but the camera?
Yeah.
The BTS, yeah. And which kind of information?
We can take the information how...
Temporal?
Yeah.
Temporal? Ah, okay. But you don't have the image of the pressure?
No.
No. Front, back, left, right, you don't have.
No.
We
can see this, but tell me another question. How do you monitor the ability to recover after the intense training session?
I started using heart rate variability when now we have a lot of smartphone application and sensor. I started with heart rate variability by analyzing raw data and by looking at literature from Soviet, because they started using heart rate variability for monitoring astronauts. And now we have a lot of research done in heart rate variability, but I use a lot, even with athletes that I have in several parts of the world. They have I have a cloud, my own cloud. They measure each morning with heart rate or with a pulse oximeter each morning, and the data are uploaded on my cloud, and I can see the pattern of recovery and understand if some changes are needed in training load. I do this every morning to check the athletes.
Test? Urine? Urine test. Urine test.
The
urine trainer.
No, not urine.
Urine.
Oh, urine. That's
analysis.
Urine.
Okay. Yeah.
You need to send it somewhere for...
Yeah.
I think
It's...
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.